I mean, what the hell does it mean when somebody says certain forms of research are redundant? Whose research? I mean, under what conditions? What interest does it serve? How does it relate to a broader conception of the university? Is it redundant because somehow you have figured out that it doesn't figure into certain financial strategic questions that have nothing to do with the value of the research? The issue is not some research is redundant. The issue is why is some research absolutely necessary for the university to take on a role that in some ways suggests it's working for the public, that the university is a democratic public sphere.
Right, welcome everybody. It's with great pleasure that I'd like to welcome you to hopefully the first of a number of different sessions discussing critical political economy issues amongst some of the largest associations across Europe studying political economy. This particular one is about COVID responses and neoliberalism in higher education. And this came out as a response to some of the redundancies that were being made in Leicester earlier this year. So EAEPE, which is the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy, which I'm the General Secretary of, put a letter up about that, and we realized that actually this is a common factor for a number of different institutions and areas. So we decided to organize something a little bit bigger, and to do that by reaching out to the other key kind of political economy associations across the UK and Europe. So we invited the European Sociological Association's Critical Political Economy Research Network, SASE, which is the Society for the Advancements of Social Economics, IIPPE, which is the International Initiative for Political Economy, and BISA's IPEG, sorry, British International Studies Association's International Political Economy Group. So we have a very large membership, and the idea is to try and get this discussion moving. So I'm really, really happy that we have some really terrific speakers today. Starting off, we have Henry Giroux.
Just as the 2008 global economic crisis revealed the failure of liberal democracy and the scourge of neoliberalism, the pandemic crisis of 2020 has revealed how institutions meant to serve the public good, such as higher education, and offer support for progressive politics, now serve authoritarian ideologies that, in a sense, view democracy as the enemy of the market, of market-based freedoms, and the market is the ultimate framework for defining the governing structure and purpose of education itself. Since the 1970s, a form of predatory capitalism called neoliberalism, in all of its diversity, has waged war on the welfare state, the public sphere, and the common good. The new mode of governance argues that the market should govern the economy and all aspects of society. It concentrates wealth in the hands of a financial elite and elevates untrampled self-interest, unchecked individualism, and deregulation and privatization as the governing principles of society. Under neoliberalism, everything is for sale, and the only obligation of citizenship seems to be consumerism. We live in an age when economic activity is divorced from social cost, while policies that produce racial cleansing, militarism, and staggering levels of economic inequality have become the defining features of everyday life. At the same time, the COVID-19 plague has revealed how a market-driven social order ignores basic human needs, such as healthcare, food, decent wages, and quality education. It views government as the enemy of the market, limits society to the realm of the family and individual, and embraces a fixed hedonism, and of course challenges endlessly the very idea of the public good. The pandemic, in a sense, revealed in all of its ugliness the death-producing mechanisms of systemic inequality, deregulation, a culture of cruelty, and an increasingly dangerous assault on the environment. It has also made visible an anti-intellectual culture and pedagogy of repression that derides almost any notion of critical education. That is, it seems to me, an education that equips individuals to think critically, engage in thoughtful dialogue, appropriate the lessons of history, and learn how to govern rather than be governed. This is particularly evident in the attacks on critical race theory in the United States, the UK, and other places that I'm sure people will speak to today, all parading, of course, under the euphemism of patriotic education. It's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for taking seriously attempts to make education central to politics. What's at issue here is the notion that education is a moral and political project rooted in the goal of emancipation for all people. Moreover, This is an education and mode of critical pedagogy that encourages human agency, enables people to be not only critical thinkers, but engaged individuals and hopefully social agents. If we're going to develop a politics capable of awakening our critical, imaginative, and historical sensibilities, it's crucial for educators and others to remember that critical pedagogy is central to creating the agents, the identities, values that create an engaged, informed citizenry. This is particularly important to me because it seems to me you can't deal with a problem until you can recognize it. And the issue of just pointing to economic structures as if they alone in their revelation will motivate people to be actively involved in some sort of politics, I think is another failure. I think unless we address the question of consciousness and agency and subjectivity and what it means, from the tradition of Raymond Williams to Gramsci to a whole range of other people, I think the left is lost. Central to the current political moment of developing a language of critique and possibility. Such a language is necessary to reveal, I would think, resist and overcome the tyrannical authoritarian nightmares that have descended upon the United States, Brazil, and of course the UK, and a number of other countries plagued by far-right populist movements and neo-Nazi parties. In an age of social isolation,
Henry, your sound has gone off. Could you just go back for about 30 seconds, please?
sorry about that.
That's better, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That's fine. Don't worry. You said fascist political parties, and I think that's where the sound popped off.
In an age of social isolation, information overflow, cultural immediacy, and consumer glut, and spectacularized violence, it's all the more crucial to take seriously, I would think, the notion that democracy cannot exist or be defended without a critically literate and critically engaged citizenry or public. Education in both its symbolic and institutional forms has a central role to play in fighting the resurgence of what I call fascist cultures, mythic historical narratives, a culture of lies, and the emerging ideologies of white supremacy and white nationalism, which, as many of you know, are really on the rise here in the United States. Moreover, as authoritarians across the globe are disseminating toxic, racist, and ultra-nationalist images of the past, it's essential to reclaim education as a form of historical consciousness and moral witnessing. This is especially true at a time when historical and social amnesia have undermined the foundations of civic culture, matched only by the masculinization of the public sphere and the increasing normalization of fascist politics that thrives on ignorance, fear, the suppression of dissent, and of course hate. Education as a form of cultural work extends far beyond the classroom, and its pedagogical influences it seems to me, have to be acknowledged in terms of resisting the rise of neoliberal pedagogical formations and their rehabilitation of fascist principles and ideas. This is really a central point for my work, because it seems to me that we talk too often about neoliberalism less as a mode of education and more as an economic structure, which is of course important, but it seems to me it's also shaping consciousness beyond simply putting in place economic structures of domination. It seems to me that one of the things that we've often failed to do and increasingly need to do is to combine a language of critique with a language, as I call the language of possibility. In this sense, I want to call it educated hope, which is a call not to overlook the difficult conditions that shape both schools and the larger social order, nor is it a blueprint removed from specific contexts and struggles. Educated hope should be an active pedagogical practice that dignifies the labor of teachers, offers up critical knowledge linked to democratic social change, affirms shared responsibilities, and encourages teachers and students to recognize ambivalence and uncertainty as fundamental dimensions of learning. I'm always amazed at how the right lives in circles of certainty. They live in binarisms that collapse the relationship between the truth and, of course, evidence and facts. And it seems to me create this surrealist world in which there is no truth, there is no evidence, and the only politics that matters is theirs. Democracy, it seems to me, should be a way of thinking about education, one that thrives on connecting pedagogy to the practice of freedom, learning to ethics, and agencies to the imperatives of social responsibility and the public good. Neoliberal capitalism strips hope of its utopian possibilities and thrives on the notion that we live in an era of foreclosed hope, and that any attempt to think otherwise will result in a nightmare. Yet the fact that remains that without hope there is no agency, and without collective agencies there is no hope of resistance. And finally, it seems to me The current fight against growing right-wing movements across the globe is not only a struggle of economic structures or the commanding heights of corporate power, multinational power. It's also a struggle over visions, ideas, consciousness, identifications, the power of persuasion, and the ability to shift the culture itself. It's also a struggle to reclaim historical memory. Any struggle for a radical democratic socialist order will not take place if the lessons from our dark past cannot be learned and transformed into constructive resolutions and solutions for struggling for and creating a post-capitalist society. In the age of nascent fascism, it's not enough to connect education with a defense of reason, informed judgment, and critical agency. It must also be aligned with the power and potential of collective resistance. We may live in dark times, but the future is still open, and the time has come to develop a political language and pedagogical tools in which democratic values, social responsibilities, and the institutions that support them become central to invigorating and fortifying a new era of civic imagination, a new sense of social agency, collective struggle, and an impassioned sense of civic courage and political will. Thanks.
What I want to sort of speak about is kind of, you could maybe see it as a specific case study within the broader framing that has just been presented so eloquently. I think Denmark is a really interesting case because, you know, Denmark, you might know it from the football yesterday, but also, you know, Denmark as the land of hygge, of the kind of social democrat nirvana, where we do still have a functioning welfare state. Where, you know, we have we are sort of, you know, energy transition front runner, where everybody's happy and you know, people wear Viking hats. But so what is actually happening in Denmark is actually quite scary and quite threatening, in particular for academic freedom and higher education in general, I would say. At the same time, I fully realize that some of this might be complaining at a very high level. So please feel free to later on in the discussion engage with, you know, how do we get a sense of where Denmark is right now and what is happening there. Now, specifically, what I want to speak to today is let me just go to the next slide. Is a process that has been unfolding very strongly, violently so, without any physical violence, over the last couple of weeks, but has been in the making for a very long time. And so I want to speak to the trigger, the context, and then sort of give a broader political situationing of what is taking place. The trigger, so to speak, was a resolution, a statement that was adopted by the Danish Parliament, the so-called Folketing, on the 1st of June this year. It is not unusual for parliaments to adopt resolutions and positions. That's what a parliament do, you could say. And this one was adopted by a fairly large majority across the political spectrum. The resolution was discussed. It was introduced earlier this year in March, April, under the heading of excessive activism in academia. The final resolution that was adopted contains, and this is a rough translation of it, contains a passage that reads, "The Danish Parliament expects that the university leadership continuously ensures that the self-regulation of scientific practice is working. This means that there should be no standardization of research, politics should not be disguised as science, and that it is not possible to systematically avoid legitimate academic critique." Which sounds like a fairly innocuous, kind of harmless statement. Everybody would agree with this. But having the parliament insist on a sentence or on sentences like this that were couched between, oh, of course we want academic freedom, but you know, you should not our science should not only be going in one direction. It shouldn't be standardized. It should not really be politics disguised as science. And you can't avoid legitimate academic critique. The way this was phrased and highlighted and sort of almost invoked by the parliament points towards a fundamental mistrust in this very same system that is actually referred to here. And that is problematic because it comes against the background or the context of an increasing and intensifying series of attacks on academics. Many of those attacks have been driven by a very small group of, public intellectuals, if you want to call them that, or politicians who like to think of themselves as public intellectuals. Denmark is a very small country. The sort of feuilleton, the public discussion is very small. It's the same kind of core actors. They all know each other. They have been engaging in these debates for a very long time. And suddenly we see that these attacks are indeed intensifying, that people are getting their political capital out of those attacks. And that's, of course, where things get tricky and very frightening, because if we see that there's more and more pressure on academics due to the research that they either publish in academic journals or the op-eds that they write in the public media, we ended up in a situation here in Denmark where academics withdrew from public debate because they couldn't possibly face the hate emails that they were getting, the attacks on social media. Interestingly, it is not just the kind of usual suspects of gender, migration studies, race studies. There is actually an enormous pressure on natural scientists coming from public agencies, coming from lobby associations. There's just been a very high-profile case against a researcher who published data that wasn't convenient for the Sustainable Agricultural Association, and they took him to court to say, you're slandering us. And that basically makes people shut up. That's the end effect of it, right? And that, of course, is really problematic because we want researchers to be involved, both critical researchers as well as researchers who see themselves more in the mainstream, but even those are more and more hesitant to come into the debate. So the parliament adopting this resolution gave all the people who drive these attacks a politically legitimate platform to continue to do so in the foreseeable future. In this wider context of the Danish higher education landscape, there's also other attacks or other tiers of attacks, for instance, that focus on, for instance, the reduction of international students and concomitant to that, the reduction of English language profiles. Because Denmark is one of the few countries in Europe has a fairly generous financial support system for students, and EU students qualify for that if they work a specific number of hours next to receiving this study support. And there's been a small number of cases of international students, EU students, who received that support and then didn't pay it back. Has caused a major, obviously with the conservative and the far right, it's caused a major outcry in the media. These students coming here, taking up study places and not paying back what the Danish welfare state has given them, without anyone looking at what the benefit is actually of international student mobility and obviously, international students coming here to Denmark, bringing their knowledge and staying here and then paying taxes afterwards. So there's this increasingly inwards-looking focus on we need to defend that which we have here in our higher education landscape. We need less internationalization, and increasingly also we need to move our educational programs out of the big cities into the smaller cities to make sure that we have regionalization going on, that there's a fair distribution of study places between the urban and the more rural areas across Denmark. And all of that comes against a broader political shift where the Social Democrats, the minority government at the moment, are really sort of letting themselves be pushed, but also themselves in this kind of enormous ideological and horrible shift, moving towards an increasingly populist and right-wing position. I have 3 pictures here to illustrate what is happening. The first gray slide that you see on the very top here is a paraphrasing one of the core protagonists in these attacks on researchers. He uses this enormous, he's actually a elected politician. He's also a sociologist by training, although he hasn't actually worked that much in sociology. But so he sort of paraphrases, wrongly out of context, random quotes from a peer-reviewed, internationally peer-reviewed research and puts it on his Facebook. People see it. This is actually wrong what he states there, and it has been sort of discussed in a lot of media, but not on Facebook, right? So people see this, people think, oh, you know, these researchers in this particular quote want to have taxpayers pay for more teaching in the Quran. And of course, that resonates very much with these kind of Islamophobic discourses. The screenshot here that you can't possibly read is something that happened to one of my projects, also on social media, where the amount of vitriol and the amount of hate and ridicule that you get is really quite enormous. You know, I'm an old person, I can take it, but they're also, one of their methods is to go after precariously employed, in particular PhD students, the ones who do cutting edge, exciting research that is pushing their discipline. And what happens when they come after PhDs and postdocs and early career scholars is that these people need support, and often they don't get it. Luckily, there's been a few high-profile cases where institutions stepped in. I'll say something on the next slide. What you see here, the last picture, is our dear Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, who is on her Facebook, to the extent that people are laughing about her, so incredibly folksy that she says here in a post, you know, I'm eating, this is a typical Danish smørbrød, the open-faced sandwiches that, you know, we're famous for, and she posts a picture of this and saying, you know, no one can take this from me, this is very Danish, and we need to have a very critical discussion about globalization and immigration, because look how Danish I am. I'm eating makrelmel. And she keeps posting these things, sort of presenting herself in a folksy, borderline populist way, connecting this with, oh, you know, those foreigners, but look at how Danish I am, right? So we see this also in kind of this migration focus, where the Danish government has despicable policies, but also inwards looking at an increasing sort of anti-elite, all those city elites, those urban people. You know, we need to find the real workers. We're a workers' party. And you see those discourses, of course, also in other European countries. So, you know, Denmark is by no means the only one, but I think here particularly dangerous one. And just let me go to the last slide of what happens next, right? So why are we talking about all of this here? Attacks against woke researchers, attacks against critical researchers are, of course, nothing new. Just look to, you know, what's happening in Hungary and so forth and so forth. Just look at, you know, what's been happening in the UK with, you know, you can't teach anything critical about capitalism anymore. What happened in Denmark was that there was the whole spectrum of actions, reactions, inactions, moments of resistance, but also a lot of acquiescence, right? Because this comes at a time where, again, there are other, where the higher education system is under increasing pressure, and people are just going, oh, like, yeah, you can't hear it, kind of la 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 la. And we are really just getting started with all of this, because remember, there's a parliamentary platform for this now. So all of these right-wing people have really just sort of smelled blood on this. What we did is we went collective, because that's the only way to go. We organized with a group of 10, 12 people from different institutions. We organized an open letter that you might or might not have seen. Some people also sent it around here and shared it. Thanks for that. By now, we've closed it. It stands at 3,600 signatures. I'll post the link in the chat for in a moment. There's also another sort of more gender studies focused letter in Danish. Ours was international, which we, you know, targeted the social democratic government, but also university leaders, other institutions, just to say, look, this is not a question of individuals being under attack, and this is not a question of, you know, those weird gender researchers being under attack. Academic freedom is something that pertains to all of us, and an attack on one is an attack on all, right? We might not have used that direct language, but that was kind of the intention. And it really gave people an idea that, you know, we can sign this. There's, of course, a flurry of media discussions. Again, Denmark's a very small country, and a lot of people get political capital out of these discussions. There's a big question here about who gets to participate in all of this, who benefits from these discussions, right? So just open discussion doesn't always lead anywhere. So we need to think about which kind of forums do we engage in. We pushed out trade unions. A trade union organization for academics in Denmark is a bit different than what you have in the UK, for instance, right? There are different trade unions where academics are organized, and some were very active, others were basically silent. That's the scary thing, that there was one union, Jeff, that didn't really speak up at all. We're pushing for that further, and we're organizing events in October to also get the sort of trade union. Sorry. We also pushed our institutions. Of course, universities should have both in-house systems in place when there are attacks. What is going to happen? My hunch is that UK universities are better at this because the legal system is different. Here in Denmark, a lot of universities simply don't know what to do. You know, can you contact HR about this? Nah, contact the lawyer, but we don't know. It's only when cases get really bad and people are sort of breaking down, then institutions step in. But we do need systems in place before that. That's our argument. So we're pushing all the different layers of institutions to really come on. But the most important thing is that we're mobilizing academics. So we have bottom-up to colleagues, hey, have you heard about this? Do you know that this might actually hurt you? And the amount of actual resistance to this initiative that I have experienced is actually quite scary, where people came up to me and said, why are you doing this? You know, are you an activist? Like, yeah. And there was this funny Foucauldian who came to me and said, you know, this is wrong. This is, how can you be so activist? And this is, you know, until they actually called out the Foucauldians in the parliament as well. And he realized that that was not where he wanted to be. And, you know, now he actually has to step up as well. But there are all sorts of questions about how sustainable are these initiatives, right? I mean, we have our workload. We have other things in our life. Most of the people who are more likely to take up these discussions are also activists in other, or politically active in other associations, other social spheres. So how can we set up these initiatives in ways that they are actually sustainable? How can we use alliances with the students, for instance, right? Our students tend to get very organized when the student support system, the financial support is concerned, but it's really difficult increasingly to mobilize students for these kind of political things. So I'm trying through this link, through critical pedagogy that was already mentioned before in the talk, but it remains a challenge to get the students to see that academic freedom, and that also in an educational context, that we can teach what we want without having to think about, oh, are we going to be reported? And then lastly, and this is why I'm so happy that we're having this discussion here, I think we need international solidarity more. And some of the most humbling experiences we've had in the last couple of weeks with this open letter initiative is colleagues from Turkey and colleagues from Hungary reaching out saying, whoa, what's happening over there in Denmark, this is scary, and you know, we know how fast things can deteriorate and everything is crumbling down and you find yourself isolated. And having those people reach out was really, really humbling, and really speaks to how slippery the slope is that we're on, and how important it is to have this international solidarity as academics, to first of all feel like we're academic workers, and workers need to be internationally solidaristic, but also that we have other forms of organization through our learned associations, like the beautiful people who organize this here now, but also through other ways of talking together and to connect more. And with that, I'll stop the screen share and I'll shut up.
Okay, thanks. It's nice to be here, and I think what I'm going to say kind of dovetails quite nicely with what Henry and Laura have covered, and I think we'll see some interesting connections going on to think through and discuss maybe. So what I'm going to try and do is talk a bit about what's happening at Leicester. As you say, it's kind of from me in the front line, experiencing it firsthand. I mean, you will have heard about it, probably many people will have heard about it, but just to give a sense of, what it's been like to experience. And then second, to talk a little bit about what's really going on here in terms of the financial dynamics. And then I want to sort of bring things to academic freedom and talk a little bit about the academic boycott, which I think has probably been our most effective weapon, if that's the right term. But okay, I'll start with the 18th of January, when essentially 145 of us across the university received an email saying that we were at risk of redundancy, had been provisionally selected for redundancy, and this included the library, information, Leicester Learning Institute, maths, pure maths, English, but I'll focus on and some other departments, psychology, but I'll focus on the business school at Leicester. That's obviously most relevant in terms of political economy here. And essentially, it was quite a strange experience looking through the list of names or receiving this email and saying, well, have you been selected? Have you? And then sort of trying to work out who was on the list and who wasn't. And we didn't correspond to any division. There was no specific division that we were in, like management and organisation. Some members, a large number of members of management were members of management and organisation, but not everyone. We weren't all members of a particular research group. The performance measure, which is sometimes used as a crude redundancy measure, that wasn't there. A number of people had been promoted quite recently, and people were at different stages. So we had no idea why we were selected. I think one characteristic feature was that those people who were on the list were often heavily active in the UCU, union officers, a number of union reps, or people that would just ask kind of polite questions in meetings, which were vaguely critical. And in a sense, that was a notable feature of the 16 of us within the business school who received this. And then we were called to a first redundancy consultation in which we were told we were being selected for redundancy because we were primarily researchers in either critical management studies or political economy. No definition was given of those terms, or indeed of what is meant by primarily, which we don't need to get into. But we were told there was a basket of indicators that was being used. And membership of the Centre for Philosophy and Political Economy was a criterion. Publishing in particular journals, such as Organisation, which is a more critical organisation journal, I suppose, or even Critical Perspectives on Accounting, apparently because it had the word critical in the title, we've subsequently heard, or having a research interest in either critical management studies or political economy. Now, we've been given sort of very rough, loose definitions of these terms, which are highly contentious. Now, this process has been going, this consultation has been going on for a number of months. And we've gone from 16, 2 or 3 people have resigned or taken voluntary severance. Obviously, it's never entirely voluntary. In many cases, it's hardly voluntary at all. And 2 or 3 people have also been taken out of scope. So 9 of us have been given our redundancy notices and are scheduled to be made redundant on the 11th of August, and I'm one of those. Okay, so we've been told that the reasons are strategic and not financial, which is almost more insulting in a sense. I mean, because, okay, if the university was in financial trouble, that would provide a sort of rationale, but we're being told that actually, no, we think it makes sense to get rid of you because you do critical management studies or political economy, or both. But it's important to keep in context that the university threatened over 100 people with redundancy in 2016, and again in 2018, and now again in 2021. And over 100 people have left the institution since January this year in terms of resigning or taking voluntary severance. But there remain 25 redundancies. Now, what was going on here in terms of COVID is that around 2016, the university was only generating a small surplus and it decided to take bigger risks and follow this logic of kind of financialized expansion and sought to develop a whole new area of real estate with large lecture theatres and a new area of accommodation. But it needed to generate the loans to do that. And it went off book to get those loans. It went to US insurance funds. And this year it's been a breach of 2 different loan covenants. So that gives you a sense of kind of what's going on. Also, it received 60 million from the corporate COVID financing facility, which is basically a loan for corporations in trouble as a result of the coronavirus. Greensill Capital, of course, which David Cameron, those of you in the UK will know, David Cameron was famously plying his trade for Greensill Capital a few months ago to try and secure various contracts amongst government ministers. So it's an emergency lending facility. It's for 12 months, and the University of Leicester increased its loan from 25 million to 60 million. I think only a handful of universities in the UK have received corporate co-fund financing facility lending. So these things give you a sense of a university in some financial trouble. It's fair to say the UCU have done quite a bit of work on this. Now, that's kind of where we are. And as I say, one of the most notable features of those selected is some involvement with the UCU, UCU membership. Quite a lot of uni officers are on the list. Okay, so what defences do we have and where are we in terms of academic freedom? Well, I think if we go to the 1988 Education Bill, I think it's important, first of all, not to romanticize or idealize academic freedom too much. Because it has, there are inequalities within the university around race and gender and class, but at the same time, it's a kind of it is something that is, in theory at least, legally protected. The UK doesn't have great legal protection for academic freedom. The key piece is the 1988 Education Bill, which ended tenure in the UK. But in effect, a Thatcherite piece of legislation, but in effect, Jenkins at that time inserted an amendment, Roy Jenkins, of course, who was a Lord at that time. And the Education Bill has this protection of academic freedom, which I'll read out because this is in effect our protection of academic freedom in the UK. Academics should have the freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom and to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves in jeopardy of losing their jobs or privileges. Okay, so the university's response when we've raised this has been one of consternation, but they've tended to say, well, look, this is about economic efficiency. These concerns about research direction are all about, have the proviso of whether they're economically efficient within our redundancy ordinances. And secondly, the second defense is we're not disinvesting from you because you have unpopular opinions or because you question received wisdom. It's because you do critical management studies or political economy. So that what's being abused here is a convention of academic freedom. And it's highlighting quite a fundamental question about, what the university is and who it's there to serve, which I think Henry brought up as well. I think the concern is that it has to be future facing. Any meaningful sense of academic freedom has to be future facing. It has to be, I have the freedom to try and work out and try and understand the world around me. Whereas now academics in the UK, certainly in Leicester, may find themselves going, well, I'm looking at these questions of climate change, these big issues. Maybe there's more political regulation, which is not a hugely controversial view, one would imagine. But they might suddenly start thinking, well, actually, hang on a sec, this could get too political. People have been made redundant for this at Leicester. Should I really be doing this? So it's really challenging, a convention around academic freedom in the UK, which is not, that does exist in law, is protected to some extent, but we're going to have to test how much it is protected. But I guess this is what makes the boycott of the University of Leicester so important. It's an example of where people have shown international support, and it's a great way of basically making people aware that there is a convention around academic freedom and a fundamental principle that's basically been completely flouted here. And please do, that's why I just closed by stressing, please do stress your your opposition in any way you can, and do support the academic boycott of the University of Leicester. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sam. And that's a terrible story, and I'm so horrified to hear it. But thank you so much for sharing. It's really important to hear these what's happening. And as you say, and as Laura was saying, it's not far away from any of us. I wanted to just open it up for some discussion now. I haven't got any questions listed here, but if the panel want to ask each other something, or We also have people from some of the other associations. I can see David Bailey there. I can see from the ESA, Juanita Elias from the from IPEG, and oh, Ray Bush has put his hand up. So let's start off with Ray, and then let's see how the conversation proceeds. Ray, could you just say where you're from, perhaps, Ray? Maybe that would be helpful.
Yeah, first of all, not a member of any of the organisations that have sponsored this event. Perhaps I should be. I'm Ray Bush. I work at the University of Leeds, and I found the presentations outstanding. And the first thing to say, of course, is absolute solidarity for Laura and for colleagues and comrades at Leicester. Absolutely disgraceful series of events which, as Henry indicated in his opening comments, are likely to deepen and become more extensive. I think a couple of things are particularly worrying, not unusual, have been evident historically. And I think that's one question to ask, actually, to what extent is the current pandemic driving kind of a gestalt, something different from what has historically happened in the way in which radical academic discourse is being structured and framed? Is this really something quite different, or is it just an extension of the way in which the public intellectual is downgraded, denigrated, and marginalized in a kind of anti-intellectualism? That's one of the hallmarks of neoliberal shitfest that we've had since the 70s. What I find very troubling, of course, is the silencing that happens to our colleagues who may want to offer some kind of solidarity in contexts in which otherwise they would rather put issues in the too difficult tray and move on. And I say this with a personal issue because since January I've been accused of being an anti-Semite, and that issue still isn't resolved, but I raise it now because it's absolutely pertinent to the silencing of academics who want to offer critical discourse and engagement with the debate of the Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, and how the UK government under the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, he's not been seen for a few years, but apparently we have an Education Secretary called Gavin Williamson, and he has been active in trying to link university funding to the debates around support for an IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So the silencing is interesting because it drives down the issue of critique. It diminishes colleague solidarity for fear. I mean, I'm of an age and of a status in the profession where I can weather the brickbats. They're personalized, although I know the consequence of the attacks aren't to be personal to me. Actually, it's about the University of Leeds not having yet adopted the IHRA, and so therefore identify academics who are critical of Israel, and therefore assume that the adaptation would mean that there'd be less criticism. So that's the kind of link. So it's not a kind of a personalized attack on me, it's more an attack that's symptomatic of where the debates currently are. But if I was 30 years younger, I would be very worried. Because it means that one can't engage with critical discourse in lectures. One has to have caveats, multiple caveats, in one's discussion of settler colonialism and the characterization of the State of Israel as a settler colony. So linked to this then is actually how one moves forward to diminish the silencing, to argue the strength of rational and critical engagement along the lines of which colleagues have just enumerated. And one way that has emerged in my own kind of personal struggle and very strong support with my UCU advocate is to try and actually ask universities not to be so easy to roll over with the accusations that are being made. And this gets to the issue that I think that Laura was making, and that is that if a student says or expresses that they've been upset, that provides prima facie case for a university secretary in this country to engage with either a disciplinary or a looking into what it is that the academic has done to upset the student. So if I was lecturing on creationism, or rather evolutionary biology, I would upset a Christian fundamentalist. Would that be the case? Would that provide the rationale then for the intervention to silence me and to prevent any kind of critical discourse? Finally, something a little bit more sinister is emerging at the University of Leeds. And that is, there is now, and I think Laura alluded to this in the way in which the Danish government is trying to distinguish and separate the academy and the academic from what is being said. And that is, the University of Leeds has just accepted a summary document in council without debate and discussion in Senate, that academics doing things in their private time or organizing meetings outside and off campus may not or should not identify their personal being as an academic or student of the University of Leeds, because in so doing it might bring the university into disrepute. Now this is a summary. This has emerged because a colleague and a student convened a meeting off campus that was debating and around the issue of Palestine, and it coincided with the Layla Khalid denial by Zoom of using their facility to project the discourse. And it was made very clear that this was a meeting off campus, nothing to do with the university. And yet the Zionist mobilization was against these two individuals who were then and have been subjected to a university investigation as to what they are doing off campus. Now, just think about that. What are you doing off campus because you're a member of the university?
Thanks, Ray. We've got about another 5 minutes, and I'd be really interested to hear some of the comments from other people, perhaps on you, Anita. You just raised your hand. The floor is yours. Juanita? Juanita, you can speak now if you can work out how to do it.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go. Brilliant. There we go.
So I just want to say thank you to all three presenters. That was really, really useful and informative. And obviously, hearing about the things that have been going on in Leicester in more detail than you tend to pick up on social media and in Denmark as well. That was really, really great to hear from you both. And thank you also to Ray for bringing up all of the furore that's going around adoption of the IHRA, which is also a very significant issue at the University of Warwick, where I am as well. One of the things that I wanted to discuss was a much more practical point around how can we sort of move forward with these conversations. So I think I would like to really thank Charlie for taking the initiative for bringing all of these different associations together in a kind of meeting of the clans event or something like that. And I would just like to say that I would be very interested in holding another event of this nature, and for us to maybe perhaps have further conversations around another event that would take a sort of similar format to this to kind of keep things going. I mean, Laura mentioned the IIPPE and Hannah stuff from Germany, so I think maybe we could reach out to one of the German IP associations and bring someone in to talk about that. And there may be other issues that people would like to talk about too. that was all I had to say.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Let's make sure that happens. And I think it will be also really good to look at the practical things that we do in our classes as well, and how we can change those to create less individualized and more collective thinking and, you know, ways of behaving amongst students. It's all very individualizing, which makes them both stressed and vulnerable and much less capable of acting collectively, which is one of the big problems that we face. Henry, your hand. The floor is yours.
I wanted to say three things in relation to the terrific conversations, and I particularly, among others, enjoyed Ray's comments. But I do want to say that it seems to me that one of the things that we need to do is we need to redefine what the purpose of education is. I mean, if we can't offer an alternative vision to what higher education is, I'm not sure how we can justify the strategies that we begin to talk about when in fact we presuppose by those strategies that neoliberal foundation which drives the university is basically normalized. Secondly, it seems to me that we need in some way to link the education that we do, not just merely to academic freedom, but to also to the mission of the education itself, of the university itself. I mean, if the purpose of the university is to engage people to be able to defend democracies, to be critical, to be active, to be engaged, to be socially responsible, it seems to me then we have a defense that we can use against the mission of the university for what we do in the classrooms. Thirdly, it seems to me that, you know, Pierre Bourdieu talked about creating an international movement for the defense of public goods. And it seems to me that's what we have to begin to do. And we have to use a language that's not responsive, but simply responsive, but a language that in some way fundamentally points to a very different alternative of what the university is against the tyrannies that we now find ourselves in. I mean, to be able to say that what's happening at Leicester is not unlike what's happening in Turkey and what's happening in Brazil or what's happening in Hungary is to demand something more. Name the politics. The politics are fascist. I'm sorry. You know, we're moving towards a fascist politics, and it needs to be named. Fourthly, and I'll end, is look, when we talk about socially responsive intellectuals, when we talk about the public intellectuals, when we talk about the fears that young faculty basically are engaging in, we're not just talking about academic freedom, we're talking about having some control over the conditions of labor that allow this teaching to be autonomous and in some way undermine the governing structure of the neoliberal university itself. That's all.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Matt, and then David, you had your hand up and you're taking it down. But Matthew, did you want to speak?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for a really great session. I really enjoyed all of the presentations. I suppose my question is just to get the panel's reflections really on what we actually mean by academic freedom. I mean, something that's bothered me for a while is the fact that we often interpret that as primarily about freedom of speech. What is it that we're allowed to teach? What is it that we get to say? And that is kind of how the public seems to understand it, I think, as well. But I wonder if something a lot more insidious is going on in terms of just the breakdown in collegiality, the lack of autonomy over actually how we do what we do, right? The kind of top-down imposition of, you know, changed teaching plans, just assumptions that university managements are the people who should be determining how we actually organise stuff on a day-to-day basis, who they themselves are probably actually responding to things coming down from even higher up, from Williamson and government and increasingly the regulator. Like a lot of our discussions in our department seem to be along the lines of the regulator has decreed X, ergo we need to do whatever the regulator says we should be doing. And I wonder often if that's in some ways even more insidious than kind of attempts to restrict what people say and think. So I'd love to get the panel's reflections on that.
Yeah, those managerial structures are so powerful, aren't they? Yeah, Henry, but that's all right, it's Matthew, Vanessa as well. So Henry, did you want to respond to that?
I do. I think it's a brilliant point, because, you know, there's a certain violence in abstractions. I mean, even when they refer to freedoms, and I think in some fundamental way, what I hear him saying and what I hear Matt saying and what I agree with is, if we're going to talk about academic freedom, we have to talk about questions of power. You know, how do you wed ideas to power? Academic freedom in a situation where the relations of power are enormously repressive doesn't really mean much, because they'll set the terms for what academic freedom means. And so it seems to me the material relations at work in institutions that then will define and respond to those issues have to be included in terms of a more democratic understanding of what institutions are necessary for freedom of expression to really mean anything. Have control over one's labor, have control over one's classroom, be able to be involved in the governing structure. Without those, I'm not sure what academic freedom really means, because it doesn't go far enough. It's not just about freedom of speech. It's about the institutions that make it possible and the endpoint that suggests why it's necessary in the first place.
Thank you. Vanessa? Vanessa Fuerte?
Hi,
There we are.
yes.
Okay, hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I don't think
great.
you can
Yeah.
see me because I cannot share my video, but you
Don't
can
worry.
hear me, so that's fine. I was just wanted to add not to add, to just put something in the mixture here and see what you think. I mean, totally agree with the panel. A fantastic presentation, and my solidarity with Leicester University. One of the things that we are seeing at the moment in various universities is the move to, as Matt and Henry was saying, the managerial structures of not just what we teach, but how we teach it. Since COVID, there was something in the news 2 days ago about Manchester University moving to online teaching. And we can see more and more pressure to actually replace the lectures that now are very bad, as we find out for students, to some videos or recorded lectures in which we don't interact with the students, in which for me, what is education for is being, actually, we need to ask ourselves what is education for. And I wanted to also say to Ray, I teach one class in Palestine and Israel in international relations. Now, if I have to teach that class in which I have to record the videos, in which I don't have that discursive co-creation of knowledge with the students, in which no nuances are taken away and it just replaces by me giving a lecture recorded, which anyone can see and post and move and so on. That is quite bad for academic freedom, for what we teach and how we teach it, and how students and us, the democratization of education in a way, helps create knowledge.
Yeah, exactly that point about the democratization of education. It's become so filtered, right? We filter these students out from their access qualifications, and then how much money they've got, and then as they go through the years, we're constantly whittling out, who can be a student. That very process of selection, again, it reinforces the individual. It separates all their previous non-university, non-journal article-based knowledge. It just makes it redundant. So you don't have any opportunities to explore people's real lives. It becomes very difficult. Sam.
I was just going to try and reflect on a few of the points that have been interesting points that have been made in a sort of uneven way. Well, I think I wanted to say, in terms of academic freedom as a concept, I guess I was drawing on it because to some extent it has some kind of legal protection. But right when it was invoked within the 88 Higher Education Act, it was seen as anathema by many conservative backbenchers at that time. What is all this about? Is there sort of, and in a sense, when you go back to the history of academic freedom, it's about relations with the church. The space for the church to express, members of the church to express their views. So, I mean, I don't want to, as I say, I don't want to romanticize it too much. But I suppose there is a notion for us today of research and teacher autonomy, and we have to protect that, and we have to protect that collectively together. That's the starting point. I mean, one thing I just also wanted to say is, in terms of teaching, one of the interesting things at Leicester that was quite a surprise for us is they didn't actually go after our teaching. I mean, they've been trying to do that in the past, tell us that we should be teaching different things. But the redundancies are on the basis of research, which comes with another series of problems. But in a way, one of the things that's kind of straight, and this is kind of what the students want, and I think one of the key things is that if you're a 17-year-old and you want to study business, you might have a certain set of ideas of what you think a business studies degree should be. I'll get, it means I'll get a job for an accountancy firm or something like that. But actually, once you've been at university for a year or two, you start realizing that pre-2008 financial models are not actually going to help you understand the world very much. And in a sense, you need to engage more with contemporary issues from different perspectives. And then there's a much greater openness. So in a sense, I guess I'm still quite hopeful. I'm saying that the space around education is far more difficult to stamp down and to regulate, surprisingly, actually, for us, than research. And it surprised me that these redundancies are purely ultimately on the basis of research contents rather than anything else. And that was a surprise to us at the time. I just thought I'd raise that.
Thanks very much, Sam. Henry, did you want to make another point?
Yeah, hold on, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I think Matt is right. I mean, I don't want to. I'm hoping my comments weren't meant to dismiss. I mean, the sort of the legal protections that academic freedom provides. I guess what I'm more concerned about is how particular aspects of what we do as public intellectuals get isolated, and in some way become the terrain on which a new struggle emerges for silencing us. And eliminating what we can do, whether it's, of course, what Ray is going through with the claim that any criticism of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism, is a very crude yet powerful language that both violates academic freedom in the most fundamental sense, but is smothered by virtue of the claim of anti-Semitism. And I guess I'm trying to think through, you know, what it means to be able to defend what we do, not simply to our colleagues and to the administrations, but to a larger society that needs to recognize that without education, you don't have informed critical citizens. You don't have a democracy, I'm sorry. And that the major avenues of education are no longer simply in the schools. I mean, they're in the media, they're in the social media, they're in the digital revolution. And so how do we embrace this notion of education, both linking what we do, the institutions we work in, with a broader conception of how powerful education has become in that link between culture, politics, and everyday life, and the new technologies. I mean, it blows up the notion of academic freedom in some way, because it expands what the terms of the conversation are and how they take place, and who has the power to define what the conversation means. I mean, what the hell does it mean when somebody says certain forms of research are redundant? Whose research? I mean, under what conditions? What interest does it serve? How does it relate to a broader conception of the university? Is it redundant because somehow you have figured out that it doesn't figure into certain financial strategic questions that have nothing to do with the value of the research? The issue is not some research is redundant. The issue is, why is some research absolutely necessary for the university to take on a role that in some ways suggests it's working for the public, that the university is a democratic public sphere and not just simply a factory for accountants or pencil pushers or managers who basically don't do anything but sit on committees all day.
Yeah, it's the context is much broader. And then I suppose looking at it on the global context, there's a whole issue about how Western centric voices get privileged over others, and there's that dynamic which is really important. And in some ways, universities reacting to COVID have sought to reach out more globally, not so much to co-produce and to share knowledge, but to sell knowledge, right? And that's become another dynamic which has become.
Let me give you another example. Here at the university in which I teach, I have noticed that with the pandemic, Donald's notion of instrumental rationality has taken on a measure of significance, unlike what Adorno in his grave, if he had heard it, would have rolled over and died again. All we talk about are deliveries. All we talk about is Zoom. I mean, all they talk about is, oh, how do you make yourself feel more comfortable on Zoom and an online education? The whole question of what the university is about, the whole question is that we're involved in a notion of climate destruction that in 10 years could destroy humanity, seems to disappear. The whole notion of what the neoliberalism is doing to the university disappears. The question of defining immigrants as criminals all across the globe no longer is an issue. The real issue is, are you using Team or are you using Zoom? And I think that in some fundamental way, this is indicative of the failure of the left to really take on education in terms of its democratic project and to be able to defend that. The issue is not just to be responsive and strategic with respect to certain cuts. certain eliminations, certain redundancies, but to take the university as a whole and be able to say to the public, hey, look, you need us as much as we need you. Because in the long run, if you only educate people to be workers, and if you believe that education is nothing more than training, there's a dark tunnel you're into. There's a dark abyss there, and the end point doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we've gone over our kind of hour period by an additional 10 minutes. I'm sorry, that sounds exactly like the kind of thing which Henry was just describing, a very kind of accountancy-based restriction on the argument. So are there other final things that people want to raise? I mean, we could obviously carry on this discussion, but I also think we want to have something which is fairly contained so that we can save it in an effective fashion. There's so many different things that have just been opened up in this last hour. My head's kind of exploding, and I'd like to draft a bit of a text which I'll circulate around us that perhaps you can edit and help us form some kind of document just to record what's been discussed. But it does seem that there's an urgency. It seems there's a need for collaboration. We've talked about issues which are around management and organization, but also much bigger important themes around not just how we teach and how we support each other, but how we understand the role of education and how that role of the educator plays an important role in society more broadly. And we need to think about how we can use those kind of arguments to push back on our universities to make sure that they are engaging with the kind of arguments which Sam's and his colleagues have been promoting and which Laura's been describing. So I'll take some time to try and write out a brief document on that, and I very much hope that we can keep in touch as a group, and certainly when we organise the next one with Juanita with BISA IPEG, we'll be getting back in touch with you, and hopefully we can advertise the event more effectively and get more people involved. But I would like to thank you all very much indeed. Has anybody got some final words that they want to make? Henry. Mike, Henry.
No, I'm fine. Thank you very much. So. Thank you so much for the discussion, and thank you for the people who participated. I think we need to do more of this. This is really exciting, and I don't think any of this can take place without a kind of shared understanding of the shared struggle that we're all involved in.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I completely agree, and again, thank you to you and to everybody else who's spoken. And David, your hand is up. Yeah, David.
Thanks. Yeah, no, just to say again, thanks for organising it, and to hear all the talks, and to send solidarity to the speakers and the shocking behaviour that's happening. Which, I mean, in a sense, the shocking behaviour is kind of ongoing. There's a constant attack on the university, I think. So I think that's part of when we're doing critical political economy. It's trying to locate our arguments within a context where we kind of feel constantly under attack, because capitalist society doesn't really like universities and critical thinking and critical thought. So it is a constant struggle. And so I suppose the point is about it's a constant struggle in terms of making the arguments, but also in terms of doing the struggle, which means organising within universities, both academically and intellectually, but also in terms of us as workers and associating workers, and not viewing those two things as separate as well, I suppose. So it's ideas mobilising collectively as an intellectual project and as a political project, and recognising that it's difficult because the critical ideas are constantly being attempted to be pushed out. It was just one final thought, actually. It was interesting thinking about the academic freedom point in the 1988 Act, because that was actually a concession, because the 1988 Act was Thatcher's removal of tenure. So it was you lose your tenure, so you can now be fired, but we'll protect some notion of intellectual freedom by giving rights to academic freedom at the same time. And now, obviously, they're coming for the academic freedom as well. So, just I think the message is solidarity and keep going, and thanks for organising, and let's do some more. Thanks.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, David. There's a couple of hands. I don't know if they're just residual hands. Vanessa, did you want to say something else? No. Okay, the hand's go down. No, Henry, your hand's up. Sorry. Sorry, Vanessa.
No, sorry.
Okay, fine. No problem. No problem. I just wanted to make sure that you had the chance there. Okay, good. So, well, look, thank you all very much. I'd really like to thank the speakers. I'd like to thank Henry for kicking us off with an amazing statement, which will circulate. and to Laura for giving a really brilliant exposition of what the experience is in Denmark, but also showing how the political really informs the discussion of being an academic today, and to Sam for some very powerful stories about how random this process of career-ending decisions can be, and how almost unpredictable this form of power is. So I think it's really important that we do get together, track it all, understand it better, so that we can work more. And I'd like to thank you all for participating, for the different associations who's been involved in this group, and Andrea, who's helped make the technology work. So thank you all very much.